everyone to Hanyang University and to Heterodox Academy's last spring forum. The topic today is militarized prostitution in comparative and historical perspective. And we will be starting with Ms. Tanya Goyal from India. Okay, Tanya, go ahead and introduce yourself and start your presentation. So this is from the Google Doc that I shared with all of you. If possible, please turn your video on, audio off, so I can see each other's faces, so we can have a more interactive discussion. So my name is Joseph Yi, Professor of Political Science at Hanyang University. The topic is militarized prostitution and public memory. And so this is a picture of Korean camptown women and US military soldiers. And the key text, the key text would be Catherine Moon, Sex Among Allies. Now, to discuss this in historical, so we discuss camptown women with what happened before, Japanese military women, and also what happened after, Vietnamese women. So in terms of history, so after 1945, after liberalization, we had the start of the camptown regime, which was for the most part decentralized toleration. So before early 1970s, US camptown prostitution was decentralized and loosely organized through local governments, base authorities, club owners, brokers, etc. The South Korean state treated prostitution as a necessary evil. Quote, the sincerity of the girls who have contributed to their fatherland's economic development is indeed praiseworthy. The Minister of Education, Min Kwang-shik. So Minister of Education, so Korean officials consider these camptown or comfort women to offer three benefits. One is they benefited the US military alliance by providing comfort to US soldiers far away from home. Number two, they provided much needed dollars to the Korean economy. At one time, the money generated at camptowns contributed 25% to the Korean economy in the 1950s. And number three, the camptown women, they protected ordinary, regular, respectable Korean women from being assaulted by US soldiers. So they offered these three central contributions. In 1971 to 1976, there was a camptown cleanup campaign. Because of the Nixon doctrine and U.S. troop reductions, the Korea's government feared that U.S. military may withdraw. So they wanted to improve local conditions. Local conditions was deteriorating. White and black soldiers were fighting over Korean women, and the rise of STDs was escalating. So to prevent that, the Korean government decided to intervene and strictly regulate camptown prostitution. Okay, and this leads to the question about the violations of women's rights. So you have two narratives. So the anti-colonial narrative makes foreign soldiers the oppressors. And we see this in movies like, Avatar. Feminist narrative makes the patriarchal Korean state the oppressor. However, scholars like Moon argues that oppression came from multiple soldiers, including soldiers, owners, workers, families, society, private clinics. And so in my class, we discussed the distinction between negative and positive liberty. So negative liberty means, in a liberal society, negative liberty means freedom from arbitrary power, coercion, detention, such as forced medical treatment. Positive liberty means access to the conditions needed to exercise freedom, such as government provided healthcare and education and protection from exploitation. So the camptown regime violated negative liberty when women were quarantined or treated against their will. Conversely, state absence, state neglect, left women under family pressure, private violence, and corrupt local officials and private clinics and club owners. And so we can ask, and we can do this in Q&A, what was more oppressive, government regulation or neglect? Okay, now part 2. In 2014, 120 former Gichuchun women sued the Korean government. They argued the government condoned, regulated, benefited from camptown prostitution while violating the women's basic rights. The lawsuit strategically used the term U.S. military comfort women. And to quote, this is from their official plaintiff statement. Starting with Japan's colonialism in Korea, a diversity of comfort women facilities were operated by the state or army. After 1945, the comfort women system that has been systematized during Japan's colonialism was continued by the Korean army and the military regime as the South Korean comfort women, UN comfort women, and American comfort women. This proves that the problems arising from the American military Migun Wianbu are a continuation of the Japanese comfort women system after liberalization. In 2017, the Seoul Central District Court ruled in part for the plaintiffs and ordered the state to pay 5 million won, about $4,000, to half the plaintiffs. Now, why just half the plaintiffs? Because these were the plaintiffs who were detained and received medical treatment. Other half were not infected, they did not receive treatment. In response, but the amount was relatively small because the court argued that yes, they were detained against their will. On the other hand, the government did not force them to be sex workers. For the most part, there's no evidence that the government forced them. Maybe other people in society forced them, such as like private businesses or their families, but the government itself did not directly force the women. Okay. However, in 2018, a higher court, the Seoul High Court, expanded liability to all plaintiffs, awarding 3 to 7 million won each. So the lower award, about 3 million, because the state did encourage camptown prostitution, which was technically illegal, and 7 million won for those who are forcibly detained and medically treated. So the Supreme Court said that these were illegal actions, but they distinguished between that it's considered illegal today, okay? But it may not have been considered illegal back then. They distinguished between what was illegal today and what was considered illegal back then. Okay, now in terms of testimony, the most striking passage in the plaintiff's statement is this. If our country considered us as legal citizens, we would not see our friends dying of penicillin injections and forced treatment. We have much documented evidence, such as from government officials, that camptown women were subject to quarantine and medical treatment, such as penicillin. But we don't have any independent verification that any woman died from penicillin injections. According to more objective scholars, such as Catherine Moon, there were no reported deaths of prostitutes treated with penicillin in 1973. And she also observes that many who are living in camptowns experience loss of memory, and they also often lie about their experience to survive. And so in my class, we discussed our friend dying of penicillin injections. This statement is factually true, lie, or is it a false memory? Okay, and for those in the audience today, if you want, you can, does anyone want to discuss this? What you think? Whether this is, you think is factually true, a lie, or a false memory? Does anyone have any comments? Okay. If possible, you can turn on your video and then we can vote. Okay, so far no comments, so let's move on. Okay, all right, so moving on. This, right, okay, keep going back, all right. So in our class, we distinguish between free speech and academic freedom. So free speech protects your expression as a citizen. You can say whatever you want, but academic freedom protects not your freedom to say whatever you want, however crazy, but academic freedom protects inquiry and expression as a scholar or teacher. And as a scholar or teacher, your fundamental duty is to pursue and teach the truth, the empirical truth. Okay? And the empirical truth is that victim testimony matters, but various and evidentiary support. The point is not to dismiss testimony, but to distinguish verified from less verified claims.
Why is it not leaving?
Let me share my screen again. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, all right, we're back in business. Thank you. Now, let's go to terminology politics. So the use of, so the plaintiffs claim the term comfort woman, but this has been strongly opposed by other groups, specifically activists for the Japanese military comfort woman. And so I want to share some anecdote. So in my class, I give extra points for students to listen to speakers from different perspectives, visit different organizations, and they also receive extra credit to visit the House of Turing every year. Okay, at least when many of the women were still alive. And so once I emailed them, do you know about organizations advocating for comfort women for US troops? We'd like to visit them as well. The director replied very strongly that no, I do not know about them, but the victims of the comfort women were not prostitutes. They did not join the comfort system willingly, had no ability, were not able to set their own fees, could not refuse any customer. These were the conditions under slavery. We're talking about Japanese military comfort women. So the comfort woman system differs radically from the type of military prostitution associated with the US military. And so this is completely different. Do not use the same term. Okay. Using terms like former Korean comfort women for the US troops is completely wrong. I can say this expression and viewpoint are the Japanese right-wing position. And so end. And so in my class, we discussed, do you agree with Mr. Jen? Okay. So this goes to the politics. Politics is very sensitive. So scholars and so activists and researchers on US comfort women are very cautious about not offending activists and researchers on Japanese comfort women. So some scholars, especially US-based scholars, argue that some US comfort women knowingly and willingly became prostitutes and sometimes lied about their experiences. But extending those arguments to Japanese comfort women is considered the Japanese right-wing position, and thus you are subject to criminal defamation prosecution in Korea and social ostracism among Western academics outside Korea. Therefore, recent scholarship, such as Ina Young, 2017, mentions the shared comfort women terminology between Japan and US, but do not discuss or research the comparison. Very few do, such as Sarah So. But arguably, academic freedom implies that both groups should be researched because both cases involve militarized sexual labor, and they may disagree in the degree and form of military organization and control, but that's an empirical question that needs to be researched. Okay. Part 4. So the other comparison that is interesting is Vietnam. specifically the Lai Dai Han and welfare stations. So we do know, what we do agree is Lai Dai Han, the children of Korean soldiers and Vietnamese mothers, that at least 1,500, according to the South Korean government, to 10 to 30,000, according to activist organizations. But we disagree is, or what we do not know is how, what were the circumstances? Very little academic research. The dominant narrative, progressive media and activists, such as the Women Butterfly Fund, extend the sexual violence frame from the Japanese military comfort women issue to Vietnam, thus implying that all Lai Dai Han are products of rape. But this progressive narrative ignores relationships and children outside of the sexual violence framework. According to Wikipedia, some Japanese researchers suggest that 90% of Lai Dai Han resulted from consensual relations. But again, there's been no discussion on this issue. I only found one Korean media article on consensual paid sex work from Mr. Gil in Hangul, and he reported about the Turkish bath welfare centers set up by the South Korean military exclusively for South Korean troops. So basically, you had a Japanese magazine report on the discovery of records by the U.S. National Archives, okay, about this Turkish welfare center. So at one report, the report comes across strongly as denialism, as an attempt to draw attention away from Japan. But Mr. Gil argues this issue does warrant investigation by the South Korean government. And if the allegations prove true, a serious effort should be launched to resolve the matter. So he published this in 2015, and for the past 10 years, there's been no serious effort by the government, academics, or media to research this question or to research about Lai Dai Han or militarized prostitution more generally. On the other hand, you have a huge research literature on Vietnamese Amerasians and militarized prostitution with respect to American soldiers, such as Thomas 2021. Okay, my final point is that because of politics on comfort women issue, the children of Native women and imperial foreign soldiers receive different levels of recognition. The most recognized is Korean Amerasians, such as, or camptown children, such as Yumire, who is a famous Korean rapper, Heinz Ward, the famous American football player and Super Bowl MVP, and most recently, Admiral Henry Harris, father U.S. soldier, mother Japanese. And Henry Harris was criticized by many progressives, not because he's mixed, but because of his Japanese heritage, because he had a mustache initially. And so many activists accused him of praising Japan by wearing a Hirohito mustache. And because of the controversy, he shaved his mustache. And as you can see, he looks very handsome without the mustache. Okay. All right, let's move on. All right. So, Amerasians used to be historically invisible, but in the past 20 years, very visible. When Heinz Ward visited Korea after winning Super Bowl, he was front page news. And it led to tremendous public discourse about Amerasians. On the other hand, Lai Dai Han has a Wikipedia entry, so it exists as a concept, but not any specific persons. Finally, how about the children of Korean mothers and Japanese soldiers during colonial period? In other words, the children of Japanese military comfort women. Okay? If there is at least 1,500 Lai Dai Han, okay, there's probably many more children from Korean mothers and Japanese soldiers, but no Wikipedia, and they do not exist even as a concept for my students. So my students have never thought about, oh, we had Japanese military comfort women. Did they have children? And if they had children, what were the circumstances? Were they all products of rape, or were there different degrees of voluntary consensual relationships? Okay, so what was the relationship? What happened to the mother and father? What happened to the child? Why are some children recognized or others disappear into silence? Okay, this is my main takeaway. So Moon's contribution is to show complexity, that women were exploited by soldiers, but they also exercised individual choice. And that militarized prostitution across history should be studied through consistent standards, sympathy for victims, evidentiary discipline, empirically grounded terminology, and willingness to question dominant narratives. That historical justice requires recognition of suffering, but recognition should not replace academic analysis. Sympathy without analysis produces sacred mythologies, not scholarship, nor academic freedom. Thank you. Okay, now I'm gonna stop sharing. Okay, thank you all for listening. Okay, so does anyone have any quick questions before we move to the second speaker? Okay, for some reason the camera doesn't like me. I'm still here. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. Now I see Tanya, you're back. Yay. Tanya, did you have some technical problems?
Yes, my computer just logged out me.
I see. Oh, your voice level is very soft. Can you raise up your volume?
Is it better?
Yes, it's much better. Thank you. Okay, can you go ahead and share your screen and start your presentation?
Yeah, just a second. It must be visible. Okay. So shall I start?
Yes, go ahead and talk. Can you maybe can you make it full screen? Yeah, okay. So Tanya will be talking about the India British Raj. Okay, so go ahead and talk, Tanya.
Sure, Professor. So I'll be talking about the structures of subjugation. It is a combined yet distinct analysis of systemic sexual exploitation in British colonial India and the Japanese military's comfort women system, and very briefly about US military camptown system in South Korea. So to introduce my topic, what does it mean when the bodies of subjugated women become instruments of governance? That is the central question that I will be talking about. And it is not a metaphorical question. It is more of a structured one. So my talk today undertakes a combined analysis of three very distinct yet thematically convergent historical systems of militarized sexual exploitation. The first one would be British colonial India. That will be between 1900s to 1945, although it started from around middle 1800s. And the second one would be Imperial Japanese military's comfort system that was in World War II. And the third one is the United States military's Kijits on or camptown prostitution system in South Korea. Please pardon if in case I am pronouncing that incorrectly. Spanning from 1950s to the early 2000s. Drawing on post-colonial theory, feminist scholarship, and intersection analysis, as well as state violence theory, I want to argue that sexual exploitation of women was not incidental to imperial or military power. It was quite integral to it, and it was quite justified through the organized and regulated environment of the state governance. So to talk about the theoretical framework, I'll be looking into and through the lenses of post-colonial theory first, to understand how colonial power structures did not merely extract labor and resources, they also extracted bodies, and sexual access was part of the architecture of domination. So it was produced in a way that was pretty much the architecture of domination itself. Feminist theory, particularly the concept of militarized masculinity, frames sexual violence not as isolated acts of individual soldiers, but as a function of institutional presumptions that male soldiers have sexual needs and that local populations are a legitimate resource for satisfying those needs. Intersectionality is indispensable here. So I wanted to look into race, class, and caste criminal statuses, but because of the timing, I'll just briefly look into it. And nationality also converges into it with compounded vulnerability towards the victims. And finally, state violence theory frames the key analytical move of this talk. So that it talks about that state and military apparatuses were not passive observers of this exploitation. It was more of an architect of this whole exploitation. So to talk about the British colonial India first, I'll be talking about cantonment system. It was in the colonialized India that was effective in mid 1800s until 1947. So it was the sexual exploitation that was formalized through cantonment policy, which is about militarized brothels to exert power, dehumanize subjugated populations, and reinforce entrenched hierarchical structures. So the Cantonment Act of 1864 and subsequent Contagious Diseases Act, which um, quite prevalently structurizes that there are some of the savage groups in Indian region, and that has to be separated from the British soldiers as well as the British population that is colonializing the India. They institutionalized a system of licensed brothels, locally called the chaklas, within or adjacent to military garrisons across the subcontinent. So that includes Pakistan as well as Bangladesh from today's context. Approximately 12 to 15 Indian women per regiment were kept for British troops, licensed and in many instances paid directly by colonial authorities. So the justifications that were offered were quite extraordinarily in their candor. So colonial records argued that access to Indian women were necessary to prevent British soldiers from engaging in homosexual behavior, deemed as un-British or to be called savage from Malinowski's analysis in sociological instances, and to alleviate soldier boredom. The regulation of Indian women's sexuality was, in other words, framed as a matter of imperial discipline and racial hygiene. So women were compulsorily registered and subjected to intrusive medical examinations, not for their own protection, but to control the spread of venereal diseases among troops. They were branded in colonial discourse as moral transgressors or vectors of diseases. But very uniquely, these women just does not include a specific part of or the group of women, but also the villagers as well as the farmers' daughters who are unable to pay the taxes to the British regime. So there was again economic coercion as the engine of vulnerability. What made this system very possible at scale was economic devastation that was happening during the deindustrialization. British colonial land revenue systems imposed crushing taxation on Indian peasants or farmers without regard to crop yield or capacity to pay. So in late Victorian Holocaust, that was documented by Davis in 2001, the resulting cycles of debt, bondage, and recurrent famine, including the catastrophic Bengal famine of 1943 that is still remembered in Bengal to this date, directly forced women into prostitution as a matter of survival. Historical accounts of the Bengal famine revealed that significant numbers of women, many of them were teenagers, entered transactional sexual encounters with British and Allied military personnel simply to feed their families. The economic coercion was, in fact, structural. Colonial policy manufactured the poverty that made exploitation inevitable. So, to survive, even they had to have participated in this process. There was another point of view to say it, that is Devdasi system. So A further dimension in the transformation of the Devdasi system under colonial rule was this one. Uh, it was an ancient practice of dedicating young women to temple services with a recognized social and artistic statuses, and was systematically undermined as colonial policies stripped temples and local kings of wealth and patronage. So they stripped their social standing, and with no alternative livelihoods, many Devdasi women were pushed into commercial sex work. Um, so the colonial reform paradoxically deepens exploitation rather than alleviating it. So while Devdasi system was something very sacred to Indian context, it became a little bit of a commercial sex working environment when it was colonial rule. But it also depends on the region. So there are other regions as well where the system stayed in its original form, but there are some regions where the system just transformed itself with the colonial rule. So to divert towards the next case study, that would be the Japanese comfort women system. The imperial Japanese military's comfort women system represent the most overt and bureaucratically comprehensive system of state organized sexual slavery in modern history. Between 1932 to 1945, an estimated 200,000 women, primarily from Korea, China, and the Philippines. This can also be depending on the population sizes at that moment. And other occupied territories were coerced, deceived, or abducted into a network of comfort stations managed directly by the Japanese military. Military authorities were involved at every level: policy formulation, recruitment, transportation, and the management of the stations themselves. In historical perspective, the system as explicitly designed to manage soldier morale, reduce rates of sexual transmitted diseases, and prevent rape of civilians in occupied territories, an objective it catastrophically failed. So the system played on structural vulnerabilities identical to those identified in the British Indian case, but very distinct again. Poverty, displacement, lack of education, and the conditions of colonial occupation. False promises of legitimate employment or factory work were standard recruitment tactics. Once inside the system, women endured rape up to 30 times daily. That is quite debatable because there are some studies that refute the stance. Um, could be more from this, but could be lesser than this. So I'm still researching on it. Extreme physical violence, forced abortions, and the near total absence of medical care. Socially, survivors, if they survived, returned to communities that rejected them as dishonored. For decades, state denial in Japan suppressed both testimony and legal redress. It was not until the landmark public testimony in 1991, I would say, that survivors began to break the silence, initiating a decades long and still incomplete struggle for recognition. I apologize in case there's anything missing because it's still in process, the research. Um, to talk about the US military camptown system in South Korea, the third case extends the comparative framework beyond the colonial and wartime context into the Cold War era, and in doing so, demonstrates that the structural logic of militarized sexual exploitation is not a relic of empire, but it persists. So I am primarily using Catherine Moon's seminal study, Sex Among Allies, in which she shows camptown prostitution in South Korea was co-administered by both the South Korean government and the United States forces in Korea. During the 1971 Camptown cleanup campaign, the two governments jointly required twice weekly venereal diseases examinations, imposed registrations cards on Camptown women, and conducted mass roundups of women suspected of being. The state was not a passive observer this year, it was an active administrator. So the South Korean government's motivation was geopolitical, retaining US troop presence in the wake of the Nixon doctrine's proposed drawdowns. Camptown women were accordingly reframed in official discourse as personal ambassadors whose sexual labor served Korean national security. So the paper also demonstrates that this framing clearly established Camptown prostitutes' sex work as a vital form of patriotism. The ideological maneuver is structurally identical to the Japanese state's framing of women's servitude as wartime sacrifice. Economic coercion was again central here. So Moon also documents that women entered camptown prostitution from backgrounds of extreme poverty and rural displacement, frequently trapped by debt bondage to club owners who charged unsure rates for housing and placement. As South Korea's economy developed and Korean women increasingly refused camptown work, um, there was another study by Sealing Shang on the Move for Love. Uh, it documents how club owners imported Filipina and Eastern European migrant workers under entertainment visa programs, conditioning international NGOs and characterized as sex trafficking. So there's the racialized hierarchies also within the camptown system that were also analytically significant. Women who serviced white American soldiers held higher status within the camptown social order than those who serviced black soldiers or US forces in Korea. um, the committees explicitly used camptown women's bodies to manage intra-military racial tensions within the U.S. armed forces. Legal recognition has been belated. In very recently, South Korea Supreme Court formally ruled that the ROK government had established, managed, and operated camptown brothels in violation of its own laws, ordering damages to 95 survivors. And over 100 women filed a further landmark lawsuit seeking to hold the U.S. military itself directly accountable in this whole system. So, to place these three cases in dialogue, it reveals that five convergent structural features can be transcended and are there, and with differences in time, place, and very much the organizational form. So, in first, I would say in every case, the state was an active participant and it was not a bystander. So whether they're through the Cantonment Act, the Japanese Military Comfort Station Directives, or the Camptown Cleanup Campaign, state apparatus administered sexual exploitation as a calculated instrument of military governance. Second, there was economic vulnerability that was the primary enabler. In British Indian case, it was quite much prevalent. It was deliberately manufactured by colonial economic policy. The poverty was not background noise, it was quite of a mechanism here that was working. Third is all three systems underpinned an ideology of militarized masculinity, the institutional presumption that male soldiers' sexual needs are a legitimate operational consideration and that the bodies of racially or economically subordinate women are an appropriate resource. Fourth is there was racialized hierarchies, structured exploitation in every case between colonial power, colonial population, the Japanese soldiers, comfort women of different nationalities, and between black and white American soldiers and the Korean women assigned to serve them. Fifth, in every case, survivors were silenced, stigmatized, and denied legal redressal of their past for decades. The pattern of initial erasure followed by contested and incomplete recognition is itself a structural feature of these systems. So, to conclude, this whole um, talk demonstrates that the sexual exploitation of women in colonial and military contexts is neither incidental nor aberrant. It is very structural, ideologically justified, and administratively enabled. From the chaklas of British Indian cantonments of the comfort systems of occupied Asia to the camptowns of Cold War South Korea, the same logic recurs. Women's bodies were instrumentalized for military governance, economic vulnerability got engineered into exploitation, and state power deployed not to protect but to administer during those times. Indian sociological literature has long centered economic and political colonization, but the sexual dimensions of colonial domination itself deserves again equivalent scholarly attention, which is still very much underdeveloped, not as a supplement to the political economy of the empire, but as one of its constitutive features. And combined with global historical affairs, these are not merely historical questions. The struggle for recognition and accountability still continues. Um, Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you. Right, thank you, Tanya. Right. Okay. So, yes, let's do, let me go to the gallery mode. Okay. All right. Tanya, can you stop sharing? Okay, so we can just see the audience. Okay, so I'd like to open it up for Q&A and just general discussion. Is there any questions or comments? I see one comment from Mindy Cutler, Asia Policy Point. Hi, Mindy, are you here? Mindy, can you say hi and read your question? Okay. Let me go ahead and read Mindy's question. Why did you not mention former Senator Norm Coleman and his lobbying work for the government of Japan to create the issue of the Vietnamese women forced to serve as the Korean soldiers during the Vietnam War? Thank you for raising that point. Since I'm based in South Korea and I work mainly in South Korea and also like East Asian studies based in the US, I was focusing on mostly South Korean and academic discourse, right? But I think you raise a valid point, right? But Mindy, can you explain a bit more about Senator Coleman's work? Okay, Mindy, you're welcome to share when you're ready, okay? All right, now we have time for maybe a couple more questions and comments. Okay, and then I think, Asa, you wanted to share about your friend's experiences, right? Do you want to share that now?
Do you mean the Filipina friend?
Yes. So just to give a little background context, so the issue of women serving U.S. soldiers is still ongoing, but the context has changed since Korea's economic development. Most of the women who are working near camptown, near the bars and entertainment facilities near camptown, tend to come from other countries, such as the former Soviet Union or from Southeast Asia. And the relationships are very, it can be complicated. Aisel, do you want to share a few words about your friends' experiences?
Yeah, so I have Filipino friends who are recently working in the bars, which are located near the American military base in South Korea.
Sure. Can you also raise your voice?
Hello?
Yes, I hear. Okay, it's much better now.
Yeah, okay. So I have Filipino friends who are recently working near the American military base, like near the bars, which are located like near the base. And I could probably call them the modern day comfort women because they are working in these bars, which are like officially bars, but some of them are like juicy bars where American military come and look for sex work. But the girls that I know, they are working just as bartenders, and some of them they are looking for like relationships with American military, maybe to get a visa, or some of them they're actually looking for romantic relationships. Yeah, I think that's what I wanted to say.
Okay, thank you, Aisel. And so just to discuss a larger context, historically, the Philippines are the largest U.S. naval base. But in the 70s and 80s, many many activists, they pressured the government to expel the base, and they eventually did in the early 1990s. And so when the government banned the naval base, it led to the loss of jobs for many workers, including like entertainment workers and sex workers. And so for a lot of a lot of poor Filipino women, some of them are divorced, they have children they want to support. They exercise constrained agency. They can either work at home or they want to work overseas. It's very difficult to get visa to work in America. And it's much easier to get 1-year visas to work in South Korea near the military campgrounds. And when they do, some of them, they get, GI boyfriends. and sometimes marriage. And so the relationship becomes complicated. It's not necessarily like one side pressures the other. It can be like neutral, where like, it might be actually the women who are pressuring the men to become boyfriends and future husbands. And so again, we want to emphasize that, we want you to exercise academic freedom, which is find out the complex truth that's out there and not just follow dominant narratives. Okay, thank you, Aisel. Okay, so do we have any other questions or comments from the audience or from my student? Okay, oh, Mindy. Okay, great. Okay, Mindy, you want to say something or do you want me to just read it? Mindy, can you say this comment? Hello? Oh, okay, that's fine. The point of the seminar is that Imperial Japan's comfort woman system was not unique, and thus the Japanese government was not culpable for creating and managing the system. Okay, right. Well, right. So, it's a very, but some people may disagree, right? Okay, but thank you for raising your comment. Is there anybody who wants to address Mindy's comment or anything else discussed today? Students, do you guys have anything else you want to share? Okay. Anyway, so so let me copy and paste this. I'll put this in the public comments so people can read and comment on it later. Okay, if there's nothing else, then I'm just gonna go ahead and thank everyone for participating in the last forum for Heterodox East Asia community and Hanyang University. Thank you for coming and speaking on these very important topics. Okay, I'd like to give all the speakers and participants a round of applause. Okay, thank you. All right, 감사합니다.